It's in our Constitution. The legislature shall, by general law, establish and maintain a system of public schools open to all children. There are a lot of things we seem to mean when we say that. But the courts over the years have helped us define that meaning. From the Molly Hooch case to the Kisaili case to the Moore case that I referenced earlier, we have continued the process of defining that meaning and of arguing these cases at the highest possible level, because we need to know what we mean when we say we have a constitutional obligation to our schools. But it comes down to the same thing. Are we meeting the state's constitutional responsibility to maintain a system of public schools open to all children of the state? Now, the Moore case was seminal in this discussion. In 2007, Judge Gleason's court established that there was a right to an adequate education, and the court defined that right. Permission to read?
Go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. Quote, the primary question in this case, whether the public education system in Alaska is constitutionally adequate, cannot be framed solely in terms of funding, but must address the opportunity for children to obtain an education. The legislature retains both the constitutional responsibility and the authority to maintain the schools in this state. The legislature has delegated supervision of education to the executive branch through the creation of the State Board of Education and the Department of Education, and it is both the legislative and executive branch's actions or inactions that are at issue with respect to the provisions of education in Alaska. That court decision further defined 4 specific measures for how we determine whether we have a constitutional obligation and whether we're meeting that constitutional obligation. Again, permission to read, Mr.
Right
President. First, there must be a rational educational standard that ensures a constitutional floor of an adequate knowledge base for children. Second, there must be an adequate method of assessing whether children are actually learning. Third, there must be adequate funding so as to accord to schools the ability to provide instruction in these standards. And fourth, there must be adequate accountability and oversight by the state over those school districts so as to ensure that the districts are fulfilling the state's constitutional responsibility to establish and maintain a system of public schools. Those were the words of Judge Gleason in a decision that hasn't been questioned, that specifically says this is what our constitutional responsibility is. It's the last 2 of these that I want to draw your attention to and why I'm proposing this amendment, for the 2 are deeply interconnected. We could point to evidence that we're funding our schools. We have a BSA. We have a base student allocation. We are sending money to the schools. At the time of that decision, the BSA was, in fact, lower than it is now. Not by much, but it was lower. If it had kept pace with inflation, it would have to be at least $220 more today than it was then. And the proposed 5% cut in this legislation would more than double that gap to over $500, below what we would otherwise be providing based on that 2007 court decision. Essentially, these districts have already taken a 5% cut simply through inflation, and we're actually talking about doubling that. But the point here is we have to ask ourselves is, are we meeting the constitutional obligation to adequately fund our schools and to provide instruction? I think that that answer is no. And I think that the court would agree. Over and over again, I've heard members applaud our schools and decry our scores and measurements and graduation rates. Either we're doing the job or not. But cutting instruction won't make it better. It can't. The court recognized this in the 2007 decision, writing, again, may I read?
Go ahead.
Under the Education Clause, funding for public education, a public education system is constitutionally inadequate only if it is proven that the existing resources are not sufficient to accord to children a meaningful opportunity to be educated. In a footnote on that page, the judge goes on to say, it may be that the legislature will need to accord to the department additional funding to ensure that the school districts are meeting the state's duty to provide a constitutionally adequate education to Alaska's school children. That footnote led to further deliberation in this very case, in the Moore case. By 2009, the court had ruled that we weren't providing enough resources and enough oversight to some of these districts that had been involved in this case. They further, in 2010, strongly instructed the department to make it right. Part of our cost processes are fixed costs. In the other body and this body's joint education meeting, we talked about the cost of operating expenses for our schools. And one of the elements that's involved is our energy costs. These come directly out of the base student allocation. These are fixed costs, the costs of rent, the costs of energy, the costs of electricity, the costs of heating. These are fixed costs in our budget. When we cut the BSA, we can only cut so far. I think what we face here are situations where some of these districts have costs that exceed what we would consider the norm. LKSD, for example, the Lower Kuskokwim School District, has an over $5 million energy budget, which is identical to much larger districts like the Matsu and is larger than even the Kenai Peninsula's energy budget. At a certain point, when you cut the base student allocation, you're not cutting anything but direct instruction in a classroom in these districts. You're actually undermining our ability to educate kids. And that is a factor that we must consider in this debate and deliberation. Back then, the court found that the deed was doing their job. As, if again, I may read, Mr. President.
Go ahead.
As the court said at that time, it is also clear that the Department of Education is providing substantial assistance and support to those districts that seek out its services. The Department of Education is also exploring many educational strategies in an effort to increase the number of students in the state who attain proficiency. That argument in 2007 led to converse arguments in 2009 and 2010 that found that the state was no longer doing this job. The state had to provide considerably more assistance and direction to those schools identified as failing because these funds were important to ensure that those kids were offered the opportunity to attain their education. Support from the department is the issue here. By 2009, the court retaining jurisdiction over Moore was issuing a blistering decision, further reinforced in March, that found the state out of compliance with these specific areas of the order and in breach of the Constitution. Permission to read again.
Go ahead.
Mr. President. In that decision in 2009, the court said, based upon all the evidence presented, this court finds that the department, through the delegation from the legislature, is not currently meeting the state's constitutional responsibility to maintain a system of public schools open to all children in the state. The schools in the chronically underperforming school districts are not constitutionally adequate. The Education Clause requires considerably more from the state in the way of oversight and assistance to those districts. And that is the second point I'm trying to make with this amendment, Mr. President, which is that the department then in 2010 had the ability to provide coaches and other support which it does not have now. So we have, on one hand, reduced the amount of money available to schools, and on the other hand, reduced the ability of the Department of Education to actually do its job as the Constitution and this, as this case illustrates and underscores, the Constitution requires. Under the Moore decision, substantial evidence was presented, and recently in these months of Education Committee hearings, we've discussed much of this. We are unable to retain teachers in our state, and that concerned the court. It concerned them enough that by 2009 and 10, they translated that into a further order, finding that DEED had to take on the responsibility of recognizing the need to help retain and to educate teachers, and far more than what they were doing. The court recognized these decisions and recognized these needs because they recognized that if we're going to succeed, we have to take care of our teachers as well. If I can read one more time, Mr. President.
Go ahead.
DEED was identified in that February 2009 order as, quote, making no effort to address turnover problems in the intervention districts or to address the needs for the considerable additional professional development necessitated by these turnover problems. Despite having expressly ordered the state to address these issues, the court in March 2010 found that, quote, the state has failed to adequately address teacher retention and capacity. All of these together matter, Mr. President. They matter because our own performance review conducted by this body under authority from the legislature in 2015 concluded that, and again, if I may read.
I thought that was the last time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Go ahead.
That was the last time from the court decision.
Okay.
The state system of support does not provide adequate services and resources to assist struggling schools. That's our study that says that. It doesn't. And in that same study, it identified the agreement that the department had made to provide constitutional obligations. It acknowledged that its support system for struggling districts and schools should include facilitation of learning communities, modeling leadership practices, modeling instruction and co-teaching, delivering professional learning, and observing in classrooms and providing feedback. Observing in classrooms. DEED was supposed to do that. They can't do that anymore. They can't do that anymore. So when we defund districts by reducing the amount of funding available, and we know there are fixed costs, and we're failing to meet the cost even of inflation, what we face is a restriction on the instruction and no ability to measure it. This amendment, Mr. President, simply says we want to restore that BSA amount. Why does it matter? Because when you cut districts arbitrarily with no evidence that somehow this will improve our ability to meet our constitutional obligation, when you slice out certainty for teachers, students, and parents, when you make education the pawn of politics instead of the pinnacle of policy, we all fail. In 2014, we voted to incrementally increase the base student allocation, but those increases didn't even bridge the inflation gap in funding since the Moore decision. And now we're going in the wrong direction and widening that gap. I recognize the reality we face, but I also recognize that there are other choices this body can make to meet its fiscal and constitutional obligations. Revenue choices that Alaskans support that we should be willing to take. This cut is not only unnecessary, it's simply not responsible. If we truly want to meet our responsibilities under the Alaska Constitution, we must accept Amendment number 1 and restore the base student allocation amount.